Shalom. Here's an interesting question. Should non-Jews who feel a connection to the God of Israel and who want to walk according to the Torah of Israel, should non-Jews keep kosher? Should they follow any of the Jewish dietary laws? This is a really interesting question because anyone who studies these laws knows that they're extremely complex. It's a difficult lifestyle. And if we know that the non-Jews, the Noahides, were commanded in one particular area that applies to diet, which is the elusive concept of Ever min hachai, which means it's prohibited to tear a limb from a living animal. And that's all. Of course, now that particular subject is also a very intriguing subject. It's not just about ripping off a limb and eating it. There are many different repercussions and ramifications of what that means exactly, and perhaps it even can be seen to indicate an entire ecological attitude and balance. But still in all, in terms of the complex world of Kashrut, which the Jewish people are enjoined to observe, one of the popular questions that many non-Jews have is, should we be keeping these kosher dietary laws? And you know that the kosher dietary laws, they have to do with a number of things. When it comes to the permitted type of meats, animals, birds, fish, the Torah gives very specific signs, very specific rules for which animals are kosher when it comes to those animals that have the split hooves and chew their cud, when it comes to fish that have fins and scales, the birds that are not birds of prey. And then, of course, there's the whole idea that the Torah tells us do not seethe a kid in its mother's milk, from which our sages derive that there is a prohibition against mixing meat and milk, even in cooking, even in eating, and even in deriving benefit from. So the world of kashrut is a world unto itself. And we have a phenomena today where we have these very precious souls coming forth from the nations of the world who want to embrace the Torah and who feel very drawn to the ways of the God of Israel. So since eating is such an important, basic, foundational part of life, this becomes a very, very pertinent, important question immediately. And so what is the Torah's attitude really about the non-Jew and the kosher dietary laws? Now again, in general we know that there are many levels of understanding, and there are many ways which we can approach an issue according to the tradition. So again, starting from the very beginning, the most basic level, ostensibly, we know in black on white that the Noahide world is not commanded in the rules of Kashrut. However, we also find it interesting that there is a midrash which states that in the future, the Holy One, blessed be He, will announce at the time of the rectification of the world, He'll announce, let all those who refrained from eating the flesh of the swine and from things that crawl and from things that swarm, let them all come forward to receive their reward. And this implies that also non-Jews, all those from all the nations, and one can infer from this homiletical teaching of the sages that God, as it were, does derive pleasure from all people refraining from those type of things. Now, you know, really in order to introduce this topic properly, we have to understand that the whole concept of eating is one of the most difficult and elusive aspects of the service of God. Because let's face it, when a person is eating, that is such a me moment. It's a time when it is the hardest to really remember God, because it's about self-gratification. And it's about, you know, my own satisfaction right now. Maybe it's a hard time to remember the whole complex relationship that I have with the universe, that there's a God in the world, and that everything that I do is for Him. And that's precisely why in the Jewish mindset, eating is like one of the highest types of ways of serving God. That's why when we're commanded to honor the Shabbat, we do so the way that we eat. And the things that we eat and the honor that we give Shabbat is through partaking of special foods. In general, our sages tell us that the table of a man atones for him. Now that we don't have the Holy Temple, or perhaps better to say, at the moment that we don't have the Holy Temple and we don't have the altar in the temple which atones for us, the table of a man atones for him, and that essentially means a lot of things. It means the way we conduct ourselves at the table, the way that we act with food, our desire to elevate that which is in the food, the life force, to a level of holiness, of rectification. So the whole concept of eating is actually a good example of how this world can be elevated, or it could bring us down. There are elements in this world that God puts at our resources in order to see how we are going to use that thing, if it will be in His service or if it will be, God forbid, against Him. Famous story about the two great sages that were together in a room, and they were talking, and someone came into the room and saw them, these two great rabbis, and he was so excited. He saw these two great sages in one place, and he figured they must be talking about the greatest secrets of the universe and all of the highest worlds and all of Hashem's connection to the universe. And so he was shaking. He wanted to just go over and lean over and listen to what they were saying. But in the other corner of the room was another of the great rabbis, and he was eating a meal, a very meager, humble meal from a plate like this. And so when these two rabbis saw this young man was so excited about listening to them, they said, "What do you want from us? Over there in the corner there's a Jew who was bringing offerings in the Holy Temple. Why don't you go over and watch him?" And their intention, of course, was that tzaddik, that third rabbi, was on this level where his own eating was like so selfless. It was totally about serving God. Everything that he did was about serving God. And that's a good example of this whole concept of the challenge, as it were, of eating. And I only say all this as an introduction, because once we understand that really nothing in this world is simple, and that even eating can be an experience that could bring us closer to godliness, and could be a connection that roots us on the one hand into this world, because we are physical beings, and that's part of the challenge of life, and we do live in a physical world. At the same time, it can be such a spiritual endeavor as well. So bearing all of that in mind, we understand that the Torah has very specific concepts about eating. Now, on one foot, in the most succinct manner possible, I just want to say that on the spiritual level, one of the ideas of Kashrut in the Jewish mindset is that there are forces associated with food. There are elements of the life force of creation, and certain things are easier to elevate to their point of fixing, and certain things are more dense, and certain things, maybe the things that God commands Israel not to eat, maybe those things are impossible to elevate. So that, the old saying, "You are what you eat." Well, there are some things that when we eat them, they become part of us, and then we're able to elevate the holiness within those things to take their proper place in the whole of the cosmic unity. And then there are some things that are so dense that rather than allowing us the opportunity to elevate them, they bring us down. And I think that's part of one of the secrets of Kashrut. But before we go one step further, we need to remind ourselves that there are different types of commandments in the Torah. There are some commandments that are called signs. They are signs between Israel and the Creator. There are some commandments that are statutes. There are some commandments that appeal to the logic. There are some commandments that are obviously ethically motivated. And then there are some commandments in the Torah that are called chukim, in the plural, chok. What is the idea of a chok? A chok is a mitzvah about which we are told from the very beginning that we will never properly understand it in this world, because it is beyond the scope of the capacity of human intellect. That doesn't mean that there isn't a reason. It means that God tells us in advance that there are certain things that I'm commanding you to do because I said so. And that is a very great cornerstone in the concept of Jewish faith, that, as we said at Mount Sinai, na'aseh v'nishma, that we will do and afterwards we will obey. We will do and we will hear, meaning first we'll do it and then afterwards we'll try to understand it, but even if we don't understand it, we still have to do it, because the cornerstone of everything for the Jew is God commands and we fulfill, not the other way around. So it's interesting that these rules of kashrut are a chok. And the reason that this is so compelling for us to understand, before we continue with a very specific question of the relationship between non-Jews and kashrut, which we're going to do, but first let's reflect on the fact that kashrut doesn't really have a reason that God tells us which is within the scope of the capacity of human intellect. Why is this such an amazing idea? Because today, everybody knows that there are certain aspects of kashrut which are proven to be much, much healthier for a person to live by. There are certain foods that when they're not cooked properly, and even when they are cooked properly, they are not so healthy, and they're associated with various types of diseases and all sorts of things. And so some people think, oh, kashrut is such a beautiful proof that the Jews are such an advanced people. Because even in the old days, they were so careful about hygiene and about the rules of how to keep themselves healthy. And that is just so not true. It is so far from the truth. A Reform rabbi once said to me, the problem with the Reform movement, of course, is that they don't necessarily recognize the authenticity of the Sinai revelation. They don't necessarily recognize, I don't know if they recognize the existence of God or not, but they certainly don't recognize that the Torah was given from Sinai and that it's divine. So a Reform rabbi once said to me, oh, we don't need kashrut anymore, we have refrigeration. And that is just so ridiculous, because it's got nothing to do with health, except, of course, that it has everything to do with health, because obviously if we fulfill Hashem's will, if we follow His instructions, if we keep His commandments, then we are going to be rewarded in this world as well. But that is not the main purpose at all. It's not a surprise that there's a side benefit, but it's important to understand that kashrut is a diet for the soul. And it has to do with the root of the soul, and it has to do with the spiritual essence of food and elevation, and it has to do with all those things that God in His ultimate wisdom had in mind when He commanded Israel with kashrut. And so to minimalize the whole thing and to say that this is a health issue or has anything to do with hygiene is a very great dishonor to the eternal, unfathomable wisdom of God. So having said all of that, we're a little bit more equipped to explore the specifics of the question as to whether this whole world of the chok of kashrut, the unfathomable wisdom of the commandment of keeping kosher, is this applicable to the non-Jewish world as well? And we're going to continue with that in our next lesson.